Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Ashley Dawson, and this is one in a series of videos that I'm making with interesting speakers whose work touches on energy humanities in conjunction with my recent book, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons. Today, I'm extremely excited to be speaking to Stephanie LeMenager. Stephanie is the Barbara and Carlisle Moore Distinguished Professor in English and American Literature, and she's also Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon, where she co-directs the Center for Environmental Futures with Professor Marcia Weizsäcker, an environmental historian. Her publications include the books Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, which I hope we'll talk about today. The book defines the 20th century United States as the era of petro-modernity. Stephanie's also the author of Manifest and Other Destinies, a monograph about alternatives to manifest destiny that might have developed in the US West, as well as Environmental Criticism for the 21st Century, a co-authored essay collection for scholars, and the book Teaching Climate Change in the Humanities. So welcome, Stephanie. Thanks so much for being in dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for inviting me.
My pleasure. So as I said, I want to dive straight into your wonderful book, Living Oil. And I wanted to start out by talking about the way in which you argue that oil is associated with the magic of life without work. You also talk about oil's association with fun things like shit and sex and entertainment. So this is quite a wide variety of different things. And it's very interesting because it's very different from what, mainstream scholars would have to say about oil and geopolitics of petroleum. So I wonder if you could tell us a little about what you are thinking of when you discuss how these ideas get put into circulation in post-1945 US cultural production.
Sure. Well, let me say first that, really oil as complementary to what I think of as entertainment or an ambient mediascape really starts much earlier than 1945. And, it's interesting to me to think about how in some parts of the US and in a certain imaginative construction of modernity, fossil fuels, broadly speaking, have created a media environment, an absolute surround. You talk in your book, People's Power, your excellent book, People's Power, about just how an innovation like the air conditioner creates this sense that we as humans invent our own climate, and it sort of made possible the Sun Belt in the United States, which is a profoundly unsustainable, site for population density that, like we see in Phoenix. So I think, oil made possible a whole set of media interventions at the level of infrastructure. Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist, tells us that infrastructure is a form of media, and I think that's important to remember. And in terms of modes of mediation, infrastructure to me is that media form that most clearly locks in desire with structures of power in a way that's very hard to then decouple as we move into what I hope is finally a transition towards sustainable renewable energy as the basis of our culture. So if you think about freeways, for instance, and the very word freeway calls up the sort of libertarian fantasy at the heart of American political culture, the freeway system, the whole idea of suburbia as a post-World War II phenomenon. I mean, these are forms of mediation, really, in the built environment that create affects, emotions, structures of feeling that are kind of broadly complementary to a hegemonic pact with what we now understand as power. So I think, that's how I see oil as connected to entertainment. I see it as a media surround or mediascape. But we could also look at the development of cinema and how that occurred alongside the development of modern oil production. When people went out into the oil fields at the turn of the century and started to see the gusher phenomenon, for instance, it was exciting. It was ejaculatory. It was Earth's bowels, effervescing, coming up in a kind of profound statement about Earth's power. This was something that was a spectacle. It was something worth seeing and capturing as a visual artifact. And so film production companies would come out in the field and photograph for the oil companies this sort of, in a way, essential modern spectacle of gushing oil. So I think in various ways, the association of oil with cinema, early Lumiere brothers films like the oil wells of Baku, for instance, shows us how exciting even oil fires were as visual entertainment. That cinema association and the association of oil with a kind of hyper embodiment that the cultural theorist Mikhail Bakhtin has shown us is fundamental to entertainment. That sense of the kind of grotesque body that plays with itself is part of the sort of, I don't know, wonderment of oil as a physical presence. But as you mentioned in your book, and I think this is true, oil can be hyper visible, but it can also be very stealthy. And there are ways in which we don't see its workings, and we don't really see how it makes possible the modern infrastructures that sustain or fail to sustain our lives. And that stealthiness, that kind of evanescence, is also something that piques desire, interest. It has a psychological component attached to it.
It's really interesting. So yeah, there's the kind of visibility of oil, its creation of a media surround, as you suggest. Is there a kind of undercommons of oil, or, you know, a kind of oil subalternity that you would track?
That's an interesting thing to think about. Is there a way to sort of poach the the oil system? I mean, if you think about how that literally works, I'm thinking about countries like Nigeria, where, you know, because of the way that infrastructure has been designed, many people don't have access to fuel or electricity, and poaching occurs all the time and is punished horrifically, you know, with murder. I think that the system that's been developed around oil is one that really, what's the word I want to use, sort of mitigates against what Desartot would call poaching, or what Moten and Harney would describe as an undercommons. It's a system that's very hard to interrupt. And Timothy Mitchell's wonderful book, Carbon Democracy, talks about that, where Mitchell literally traces how the development of oil infrastructure in a distributed way made it very difficult for laborers in the oil industry to strike. So the labor movement kind of gets derailed, quite literally, by oil infrastructure and the modes of development that it underwent, whereas the coal infrastructure was one in which striking and various kinds of labor power were imminently possible. Now, of course, now we have a whole complex of energy development kind of interlocked with one another that's very hard to interrupt or to break. But it's hard for me to imagine an oil undercommons. That's a really interesting question. Do you, in your work, have you seen something like that?
Well, I suppose what I was asking there, or what I was thinking of by asking that question, was the way in which oil has come to be associated with this kind of entrepreneurial sublime. And I think when you were talking about suburbs and these kind of ecstatic images of mobility and power that automobile ads seem to incarnate in the United States in such a kind of crystalline form, that's the kind of prototypical instance of what you've been describing. So I suppose I was wondering about alternatives to that idea of kind of neoliberal entrepreneurialism, either kind of in previous moments in US history, particularly during a moment of energy transition when everything seemed to be kind of up for grabs, or else in other geographical sites. And I was particularly thinking about uprisings for control of resources, either in representation, like in a novel like Cities of Salt, which represents the arrival of the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, or else, in real instances, like when oil was nationalized in Mexico in 1938, and the ways in which that was kind of put into cultural circulation in various different ways. So I don't know if you've thought about any of that, although the example of the Niger Delta is certainly an important kind of instance, and we could talk about that more if you'd like to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think of undercommons as not really associated with nationalization, but I think nationalization, and making public the resource is something that is really interesting and has allowed oil to play out in different ways internationally. Unfortunately, I think that what scholars have called the oil curse tends to come to countries with oil resources, regardless of whether the resource is nationalized or not, although the particular modes of immiseration that derive from oil culture are distinct. I mean, I love this question because it's such a hard one for me. And one thing I thought about, because I'm a literature scholar primarily, was in critical dystopian novels, in other words, novels that offer a dystopia that's meant to be a kind of criticism of the contemporary, that's generative of something better. So they're not dystopias that just sort of exalt an end of the world fantasia, but dystopias that want to move us somewhere else. A novel like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, terrific, brilliant novel about anti-Black racism, about colonialism, about climate change, and about the infrastructures of oil in California and elsewhere. In that novel, the space of highways becomes a space of what I would think of as undercommoning, a kind of interracial, what we might call BIPOC, collaboration of individuals trying to find community and to find a different way to live, and trying to radicalize democracy and really live democracy in the way, again, that you talk about in the current book, which really has never happened in this country. And one of the reasons it hasn't happened, I think, is precisely because of the way that our fossil fuel systems have become wrapped up in our systems of governing. So I can think of fictional, counterfactual versions of an oil undercommons, particularly via Butler. There's probably others that are not coming to mind right now. But in reality, I think this resource doesn't empower most human beings. Even those who work in industry, kind of on the front lines in the fields, who may feel very reliant upon and identified with the industry, have lived through so many ups and downs with the way that oil has been financialized, that life is rough.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important issue to keep in mind. So, not just the role of oil in relation to empire and all of the kinds of affect that gets mobilized around empire. Trump's energy dominance policy, for example, is a perfect example of that. But also, the internal sacrifice zones of indigenous people and other folks, and also the way oil victimizes women, so the kind of gendered and sexual politics of oil as well is something really important to keep in mind. So I think your assertion that nobody ultimately benefits from oil, and that's certainly true in the current moment where we're getting pushed off a precipice towards climate chaos by the fossil fuel economy. And the fossil fuel economy is itself crashing, right? I mean, we live in a moment because of the pandemic and the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, where fracking is in crisis and many fracking companies are going bankrupt. So I wanted to kind of bring us a little bit into the present moment, because your book, Living Oil, was written largely before the Trump regime came to power. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on how some of the issues that you discuss in relation to the media, oil, affect, and fossil capitalism have been inflected by the rise of this very distinct reactionary formation of Trumpism in the US.
Right. Well, let's start by saying that I think Trump really embodies and enacts this structure feeling that I've called petro melancholia. And what I mean by petro melancholia is the unresolved grieving of oil as a resource that defined, in some respects, the American century, a resource that seemed to create the conveniences of so-called modern life for US Americans, that seemed to be an endless source of economic buoyancy, that seemed to be a route towards the sort of speeded up futures of hypercapitalism, which for a time, around the era of the Great Acceleration, seemed to be benefiting a broad middle class. Now, of course, oil was always a racialized form of capital. It always had this ability to kind of complement the possessive investment in whiteness that George Lipsitz talks about. But I think it really did seem to exemplify a certain American presence in the world and a sort of futurity that is allied with modernity, hence petro-modernity. But petro-melancholia is the grieving of all that. And that's what Trump, I mean, he exemplifies it. You know, he has become uh, offering a kind of populist promise to an electorate in which, you know, many people are experiencing economic precarity and misery. You know, he really has come on board as the ultimate neoliberal, but a neoliberal, you know, who kind of combines his neoliberalism with a profoundly racist and xenophobic fascism. All of this sort of grotesque display that Trump offers to us is in some ways just a sort of cover, in my view, for a set of deregulatory policies that liberate the now zombie systems of fossil fuel production to engage in more and more dramatic, injurious, violent forms of extraction. So, you know, he's kind of threaded the needle that maybe wasn't fully threaded in the popular imagination between what it means to be a white male in this country and the fossil fuel system. He has allied big cars and trucks, oil and coal, and in fact, a dedication to a lack of self-care, which we see in the anti-masking movement, to what it means to be energetic, powerful, and male in this country. And it's a terrible moment for the country, and I think a terrible moment psychologically as well as economically and socially, because what Trump is doing is distributing a set of affects, a set of structures of feeling that drive masculinity particularly into a very, very narrow corridor in which it's attached to nihilistic systems of extraction and production. So I do feel like Trump came around at precisely the moment when it became clear that the shale revolution was starting to fail. and he becomes the next iteration of keeping those zombie systems going and attaching different charismatic feeling states that are charismatic, obviously only for some, to those modes of production.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. The Make America Great Again hat, you couldn't find a more obvious exemplar of petro-melancholia. I'm sure it's actually made of fossil fuels, you know, various forms of plastic, the hat itself. But yeah, that kind of structure of feeling is so key to everything about Trump. I think that's a great analysis. So how do we get out of this cul-de-sac, you know, this really deadly cul-de-sac, which is leading towards all sorts of horrendous forms of ecofascism, as well as extreme extraction of various different kinds? A couple of weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to talk to Johanna Bozua of the Democracy Collaborative. As I'm sure you know, she and her comrades have published some really interesting forward-thinking proposals about nationalizing fossil fuels in general, and particularly the kind of grievously wounded and dying fracking industry. I wonder what you think of those proposals, and then, you know, how can those sort of policy proposals be leveraged in terms of political transformation and the mobilization of collective feelings towards some more hopeful tomorrow than this kind of toxic masculinity of Trump?
Right. You know, those are questions I wish I could answer. I think I'd have be on a higher pay scale, or maybe I wouldn't be employed at all if I could answer those questions. And I think I would ask reader or ask viewers to look at your book, People's Power, in terms of some of those answers as well. I'll say a few things though. I think about Frederick Jameson talking about utopia. That might seem like a strange place to start, but Jameson, you know, talking about utopian imagining, largely in the context of the US, but worldwide, and how in order to attach sort of cathect to something that truly interrupts the present, and his whole idea of the future is that which interrupts the present, that thing that you have to attach to in a moment of transition like this one must be really kind of closed as a narrative. It needs to be a narrativized object. It needs to be something that a lot of people can kind of cathect to. I think this is why it's so hard to imagine a new order being born. Petro-modernity is a very tight story. It is a story that involves colonial genocides, that involves racism of various kinds, including anti-Black racism, involves all kinds of gender dysphoria, but it's also a very tight story about present tense leading to future tense, allied to speed and all kinds of petroleum-enabled pleasures. So what comes to the fore to replace that? What is the eros, for instance, of renewables? So, I understand that, there's political solutions must be had, policy solutions must be had, but we also need to do something with the stranded emotions. That phrase is Jennifer Wenzel's, the stranded emotions that are left behind in the wake of fossil fuels, how to redirect those. Right now, the story of renewables in this country in particular is one of intermittency. It's the intermittent tempo, it's the uncertainty of intermittency, it's the fact that our grids, as you write about, aren't really designed for renewable power. And it hasn't been eroticized really. It hasn't been made desirable. I do think hegemony has to do with desire locking to power, as I mentioned when I talk about infrastructures. And I think as we kind of think about new forms of people's power, there has to be various ways in which desire gets locked into that or kind of called into that new formation. And I think one way is to think through various state-based solutions and democratic socialism and think about a kind of real democracy and a democratization of the banks and the Fed and the various institutions that are really have never really been in the service of the people. And on the other hand, I think some of the social movements involved with the water protectors, Standing Rock, the kind of ally movements that came to the Standing Rock location when the indigenous communities there were acting as water protectors. I think those social movements are also really important. They have different sort of political shapes. I mean, obviously indigenous nations for millennia have been practicing water protection, as Nick Estes reminds us in his wonderful book, Our History is the Future. So this is a sort of whole set of practices that are for indigenous futures and indigenous self-governance and need to be respected as such. But I think some of the wisdom that comes out of those millennia of indigenous resistance is beginning to sort of be present in the larger settler colonialist culture. We're beginning to recognize that we are a settler colonialist nation, for instance. Many of us begin to recognize this for the first time. Some have known it for a while and been thinking of it for a while. We begin to be excited about a culture in which relationality, kind of the interrelationship of all life is at the center of how we think about energy. I think that's a profound rethinking of energy that comes from water protection in this particular moment, in that particular movement. And then on the other hand, there's all the excitement and possibility located in nationalizing resources, democratizing financial institutions. So somehow the kind of excitement that I think is attached to social movements right now around climate and water protection need to be more clearly articulated to these policy solutions having to do with the infrastructures and institutions we now have and retooling those so that they actually serve a broad populace.
Earlier, you talked about Octavia Butler as a kind of exemplary, offering an exemplary imagination of some kind of undercommons. I wonder if you can think of any speculative fiction that mobilizes exciting sort of eros around renewable energy. Are there things you've been reading recently that you find interesting, even if they're flawed in various different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things come to mind. I still am intrigued by Kim Stanley Robinson as one of our only utopian thinkers within the world of cli-fi or climate fiction. And I do think New York 2140 is, and I don't know, as a New Yorker, I'd be curious to see what you think of it. I do think that's a really interesting text in which to explore various forms of commoning. So you talked about energy commons. I think, Robinson's also very interested in bringing the commons back into political life at the foreground, really, in local kinds of mutual aid associations, cooperatives, et cetera. I think about your book, Extreme Cities, which also gives us a sense of what you call disaster communism. So, I think that particular book is one in which your renewables play a part, but also a whole new way of thinking about economy in terms of both mutual aid and regenerative resources. So that one I find particularly exciting. There is the whole genre of solar punk, which I think you may have mentioned at some point in the book, I don't recall, but, and solar punk really is all about making renewables exciting and just visualizing and materializing their possibility. Frankly, I haven't found one solar punk work that I find incredibly convincing, but I will mention a terrific short story by N.K. Jemisin called The Effluent Engine, which is a sort of alternative history in which Jemisin imagines that as part of the Haitian Revolution is to take one of the effluent byproducts of rum production and turn it into a renewable energy resource. So that's a terrific short story. Again, N.K. Jemisin, The Effluent Engine, where we see a kind of anti-racist alternative history of the Americas in which Haiti becomes the source of a new version of modernity based in a renewable energy system. And I think what I really liked about that particular short fiction is that it makes very clear the contingency of the system we're in now, the fact that it absolutely was not inevitable. And it is not inevitable that we go forward with it. It does not have to be, it doesn't have to be given the zombie afterlife that those who've invested deeply in it wish to claim for it.
Yeah, it's I think so useful to look backwards in order to think about alternative possibilities for the future. I haven't read Jemison's short story, but it sounds really important, and it reminds us, I think, of the fact that energy is complicated and isn't always exclusively in what we might associate with it, like fossil fuels, for instance, or solar panels. That energy has been human labor or animal labor historically for the vast majority of human history, and that has come with crushing forms of exploitation. So, thinking about how we're going to avoid a future in which those forms of exploitation get revived. Of course, they never actually went away, but get intensified in various different ways is I think really important. So thanks for those references. I wanted to ask you one final question, and that has to do with transnational solidarity. And, of course, bringing up the Haitian Revolution already inaugurates a conversation about that. The Haitian Revolution being such an important site for uprisings in the Americas across history. In your book, Living Oil, you talk about connections between the Louisiana Gulf era and the Niger Gulf, and the ways in which oil plays similarly in those different places. I wonder how you think about mobilizing solidarity in the present moment. And, I'm thinking particularly about the kind of conundrum of some global South countries arguing that, it's time for them to develop, and they want access to energy. And in some instances, in many instances, this means building out coal. Think about India, for instance, or my own home country, South Africa, where coal is a key resource, and also a sector where many people are employed. And so very tragically, even though there's a public utility, ESCOM, they remain very much stuck into coal. And the unions are unwilling to back a transition to renewable energy. So, how can we think about forms of viable transnational solidarity as we fight for energy transition and for better tomorrows?
Yeah. Well, that's a really important question. And my own reading that led to me thinking about the Niger Delta in relation to our Gulf Coast in the United States was, I was looking at Rob Nixon's work on Ken Saro-Wiwa and how the Ogoni movement in Nigeria became a model for other indigenous and anti-colonial movements against the various forms of violence that are attached to energy production. And then also Naomi Klein's work on the concept she calls blockadia, kind of international movement, loosely articulated movement to block various energy infrastructures like pipelines. I think that's been really important work along those lines as well. I think within the United States, there's a tendency, even among, very learned people, to not recognize how profoundly connected we are globally, or to recognize that there's degrees of immiseration in places like the Niger Delta that are profound and typically greater than, although increasingly more and more equal to, the kinds of immiseration that we see at sites of fossil fuel production in our own country, in the US. So I just feel like that international frame has to be present. Globalization, of course, is an international, system and mode of thinking, which has its sites of friction, as Anna Tsing writes about so beautifully, and its glitches and places where it hasn't really fully formed. But it is the context in which petromodernity thrives, and in which the now zombified version of it continues. I am in no position to speak to the global South or to the less wealthy of the world about which resources can or cannot or should not be developed. But I do think that wealthier nations can think about various forms of climate justice, modes of helping to subsidize energy production in those countries, to make possible what might seem now to be, investments that are too steep, but would help to mitigate global climate change. I do believe in really thinking hard about how various forms of subsidy can be offered to parts of the world that did not create the current climate crisis with the kind of intensity that the hyper-consuming global north and wealthier world has done. So I think, kind of thinking about redistributive economics within the framework of colonization and climate change is one way to think these connections. And I also think, countries in the wealthier world that can begin to truly transition. I give some credit to Germany. I know I'm not, so educated on the scene there that I'm sure there are things that people are concerned about and are not working with their energy transition. But I do think when countries really begin to work hard to move towards renewable systems, they begin to model the possibility of that transition for other nations, and maybe give us in the wealthier world a sense of exactly how we would invest in nations such as India to collaborate with them to create systems that are, again, not going to spike a greater set of climate crises than we're already experiencing. And of course, the poorer that a nation is or community is, the more likely that community or nation is going to be at the front lines of climate collapse and suffer more greatly from it.
Yeah, I think you really make crucial points. And it seems to me that we're going to have a hell of a fight on our hands around Green New Deal, assuming that we get rid of, President Petro melancholia and get Biden and the Democrats in. I think that the knee-jerk position, even for the Democrats, is a kind of inter-imperial competition narrative. So, we see with Biden the idea that the Green New Deal is going to make us more competitive economically, and we're going to use these new clean technologies to dominate our economic competitors, rather than the kinds of international solidarity and real kind of recompense for centuries of exploitation that I think you're talking about. So I think the idea of mobilizing affects of solidarity is a really key one in terms of pushing for a different set of possibilities going forward, not just in terms of, shifting infrastructures, but, shifting senses of political possibility globally.
Yeah, I love that idea of affects of solidarity. And I do think that we're entering, in order to keep the transition that we're on the brink of as a transitional moment and something that can actually develop into a future in Jameson's sense of that which interrupts the present, I think social movements are going to have to we're all going to have to keep going. And I think one of the big questions is, how to distribute stamina amongst people involved in these movements, how to provide sufficient self-care, especially as we see, probably more pandemics. I mean, we're going to be living with COVID for quite a long time, but it isn't the first nor the last pandemic that we will experience, and it's likely that these pandemics will become more frequent. So how do we distribute stamina among members of social movements so that we can continue to apply political pressure on parties in this country? I'll just stick with the United States. Neither one of our major political parties really wants to make change. I mean, they're both very much stuck in the past, in the kind of moment of the Great Acceleration. They're not the only strides that I think we've made have been because of the pressure that's been applied by social movements. And that's going to have to keep going. And I do think, how to distribute stamina among members of those movements and sort of provide networks of care will be very important.
Yeah, that's such a great place to wrap up. Stephanie, it's been a huge pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for speaking with me. It's been really great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your work, Ashley. I'm a fan.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.